The president is responding now.
As long as I'm president of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon.
We've been awaiting Donald Trump's response to the Iranian missile strike. 15 missiles, at least by the United States estimate, 15 missiles were launched at U.S. bases in Iraq. 2. They were launched hours apart, or 1 hour apart from the other. Last night, we were uncertain if there were any casualties. This morning, we know there were no casualties, and there were, I would imagine, damage wherever the missiles hit. We were expecting Donald Trump's response, because this response could have been from everything to, we've just responded to an unprovoked attack by Iran, which is what Donald Trump would have said, or what he says here. This was a piece of propaganda that would have made Goebbels sit up. It's extraordinary in regards to the things that Donald Trump is saying in this particular statement. Drop context and point. That seems to be the strategy. That's what works on mainstream media news, especially in the United States. So that's what he goes with. Drop context and point. It's all Iran's fault. We were the good guys. We were the good actors. We were positive influence and force. And those rascal Iranians just keep mixing it up. And so we had to outright assassinate one of their political people who we are consistently calling a terrorist. Yes, it's a piece of propaganda, but it's also a de-escalation. Trump is adding on more sanctions, but at this point, the sanctions he's tried to strangle them with the sanctions he has already been putting on. But sanctions are different than military force, even though sanctions are in and of themselves an act of war. I guess my point is Trump has already put sanctions to the hilt on Iran. I am unsure of what additional sanctions he could add to up the ante from that standpoint. But that is not military action. And that's the point. The killing of General Soleimani was a military strike. The killing of the other Quds force, essentially under the Iraqi or the auspices of Iraq. Again, there was a strike on Iran personnel. There was a direct strike from us using our armaments to kill Iranians and Iraqis. In this case, though, this is sanctions. Trump could have came out here and said, we're going to do military strikes. He didn't. He's de-escalating. What you're seeing is effectively gravity. Early on and throughout this process, Trump has pulled back from the brink of a war, going with this notion of a pressure strategy, but not necessarily seeming to want to go over the edge, despite the fact that the people around him do. And here we have again him pulling back. There's something that needs to be said about this. I'm going to let him play out because it's not a long statement. But there's things that need to be added to give context. The Iranian government notified the Iraqi government that the attack was coming. The Iraqis tipped off the Americans. The Iranians even notified them to some degree on which areas to make sure your people are not around. Now, do we honestly believe that the Iraqis were not going to tip off the Americans that this was going to take place? Of course they were going to tip off the Americans that this was going to take place. The Iranians, I would imagine, knew that they were going to tip off the Americans when this took place. I was right yesterday when I made this point that the Iranians are forced. This is something that's personal to them. By the same token, the Iranian government has a responsibility that goes above and beyond the interests or the anger and the angst of the public at what the United States did. They also have to pay attention to the fact that whether or not the U.S. can invest the trillions of dollars and the 200, 300,000 people that it may take to subjugate a population this size or this large is secondary to the fact that they can kill a lot of people, and we are extremely good at murdering large swaths of people with our weapons. We have $1 trillion military. That military, when it's put into action, can do a lot of damage. They know that. Whatever response they have, the response has to be under a bar where they don't necessarily believe that the United States will overtly respond. I hope you understand what I mean. This is quid pro quo. By the same token, there can never be a proportionality in this because ultimately the U.S. would go to war especially with the people that are around Trump, whereas the Iranians, again, don't want war. What's important here is this is a level of brinksmanship that needs to be understood. And just because you might have Trump who may not necessarily want a full-blown war, he wants concessions, and the Iranians who may not want a full-blown war, that doesn't necessarily mean that this won't happen. This killing could have stepped over a line. The Iranians' response from that killing, again, could have been taken as a provocation for war. All of this could have been taken as a provocation for war, and at some point that line will be drawn in the way that neither side can back away from. Whether or not the population of Iran accepts this token action, at the very least, it allows the government to say and save face, we, struck back at this. But it made it very clear, if you respond to this, meaning if you attack us, we will attack the multiple elements in this particular region. They were very clear. Don't respond. Quid pro quo. I don't know how you get off this ride where one side does something, the other side responds, especially when the other side also is most likely to respond. But the catch here is these are sanctions. And Iran's messaging in this is, we had to respond, so we responded. No, this is not necessarily proportional to you killing one of our heroes here. However, we had to do something to get across to the public and appease the public's anger, not to mention our own. By the same token, we at the very least acknowledge that you could injure us. It's politics at a high level, and you must always have the ability to save face, otherwise you're going to end up in a conflict. Let's take a listen to part of this statement, because I want to point out parts that are just outright unhinged. Welcome to the soapbox. Shh! My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support. PayPal, Patreon. This video is not going to be long. I just wanted to show Trump's response. Like I said, the response is a level of propaganda that is breathtaking. By the same token, it is a de-escalation. Trump could have very well come out here and say, we have launched strikes on Iran because they struck us. He didn't do that. Yes, he said very bad things about them, but at the very least, he ended up with, we're going to apply sanctions. Let's take a listen to Trump on this. The speech is short, so let's keep it short.
Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases.
Now, the question is, did Iran have the capacity to do more? Meaning, if they really wanted to give the United States, or for that matter, the world, a black eye, could they have done more? Yes, they could have done more. And those targets wouldn't necessarily have been in Iraq. Those targets would have been in Saudi Arabia. They would have been in Bahrain. They might have been potentially been in Israel. I'm making a point that this is asymmetric warfare. You don't necessarily have to attack the country per se in order to give that country a black eye, especially when many of these countries around them are allies. They were warned. I hope you understand my point. The attack was a token attack. We need to give acknowledgement to this. By the same token, it's a level of proportionality where we lower the bar to some degree to say, okay, this is our response to what you just did, but don't go further because we're willing to go further also. But they, again, alerted the Iraqis who alerted the Americans. If this was a genuine and severe assault, they would not have done that. This kind of goes back to my argument that this was a token attack for the population, while at the same token, not necessarily pushing it too far where it would justify, or where the U.S. could legitimately justify attacking them. Keep going.
Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked.
Yeah, that early warning system was Iranians telling you that the attack was coming. That's what the early warning system was. Let's keep going.
Worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over. Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. We will never let that happen. Last week, we took decisive action to stop a ruthless terrorist from threatening American lives. At my direction, the United States military eliminated the world's top terrorist, Qasem Soleimani. As the head of the Quds Force, Soleimani was personally responsible for some of the absolutely worst atrocities. He trained terrorist armies, including Hezbollah, launching terrorist strikes against civilian targets. He fueled bloody civil wars all across the region.
Drop context point. Drop context point. Now, think about what he's saying here. Ultimately, Soleimani was a general for his country. The U.S. invaded Iraq on a lie. We killed 1 million people in that country. The notion that someone works with the Iraqis in order to push back U.S. aggression, and that person is a terrorist because they're pushing back U.S. aggression and invaded the country on the premise of a lie, is extraordinary. Drop context point. The entire speech is this way. In fact, I'm just going to put the speech at the bottom. I've listened to this more than once, and the entire speech is this. It's him giving this propaganda-laden message. In fact, I'll let you hear it. I'm quibbling over.
He viciously wounded and murdered thousands of U.S. troops, including the planting of roadside bombs that maim and dismember their victims. Soleimani directed the recent attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq that badly wounded 4 service members and killed 1 American.
Just so we're clear, there's no evidence for this. There's no evidence for this. He's provided nothing. You literally have to take Trump's word at face value to believe any of this. And this notion that there was an imminent attack, what does that mean? There's an imminent attack. It means kind of like what cops say. I was terrified. The guy had orange juice, but I was terrified. The guy was completely naked without a weapon, but I was terrified. It's that argument. It's the notion that we think this guy might attack us. And to be honest, we don't even know that. I don't know that at all. All of this, for the most part, is Trump just saying it. You have to take him at face value. I have no idea why you would do that. No idea. Let's keep going.
He orchestrated the violent assault on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. In recent days, he was planning new attacks on American targets, but we stopped him. Soleimani's hands were drenched in both American and Iranian blood.
So are yours. So are yours. 1 million people died in that war. That's why I'm always astonished with this. And that's why this always grates my ear when I hear Trump give speeches like this. This is a level of propaganda that is breathtaking. Soleimani's hands are drenched in blood. Maybe, but so are yours. So are yours. Also, we don't know if this is true. And I would wager that it wasn't. Soleimani was in Iraq, diplomat, general, under the request of the government itself, meaning he wasn't necessarily there sneaking into the country. He was there because he was supposed to be delivering a response to Saudi's proposals of negotiations and peace talks. That's what he was there for. What Trump is talking about, there's no evidence for at all. There's no evidence for it at all. And think back to the Iraq War, the cherry picking of information in order to make it look like something was there when it wasn't. I've seen this before. I was alive during that particular time period. And if I'm being honest, Trump is worse at it because he lies so breathtakingly easily. Here.
He should have been terminated long ago. By removing Soleimani, we have sent a powerful message to terrorists. If you value your own life, you will not threaten the lives of our people. As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior.
Right here. This is called saving face. Now, both sides are effectively doing this. The Iranians has to do something. They have to do something. You've just killed one of our people, and one of the main responsibilities of government are keeping their people safe. And if you can't keep somebody who's close to the head of state safe without a response, then that's somewhat of a problem from the way the population looks at its government. They had to do something. So they did something. They sent the missile strike. The missile strike was their way to save face. It was weakness posing as strength. Ultimately, we're going to send a missile strike. We're only going to send 15 missiles. We're going to give advance warning. We're going to ensure that there are no casualties in this missile strike. What military action doesn't necessarily try to pull casualties? If you're trying to really balance the scales, then you don't alert the Iraqis. You send more than 15 missiles. You send them at targets that will hurt. This, again, was a safe face-saving mechanism. Weakness posing as strength. This is exactly the same. If you notice, he's using the term powerful sanctions because the goal of it is to make it look more extreme than what it is. When Iran's saying, we sent 30 missiles, and the U.S. says, well, we found 15. Well, again, we want to make this seem more widespread and more devastating than what it may actually be in practice. Powerful economic sanctions. Wait a minute, they just sent missiles your way. And you said these guys have done all of these things, and now they're attacking our personnel, and you're not responding in kind? No. So he has to use the language. Powerful sanctions. We're going to cripple their economy. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. They're never going to get up. The language, the tone is everything of this kind of big alpha male type thing. But what he's talking about is ultimately just a de-escalation. It's a face-saving mechanism. It's the same thing when they shot down the drone. And Trump comes out. Everybody is telling them to launch. And Trump says, I'm not going to launch, but I'm going to do powerful economic sanctions that's going to strangle their economy. Same thing. It's puffing it up to make him look bigger because you have to in some way get across to the public that you're responding to the missile attacks. But again, it seems his goal, he doesn't entirely want a war. He wants concessions. I would be curious to hear what's going on behind the scenes in regards to what he was being advised to do in this situation.
In recent months alone, Iran has seized ships in international waters.
So have we.
Fired an unprovoked strike on Saudi Arabia and shot down two.
That was the Houthis. Those are Houthis. The Houthis claim credit for that. If you want to say that Iran backed them up as a proxy, okay, fair enough, but you're backing Saudi Arabia. We're backing Saudi Arabia, so we don't necessarily have any room to point on this. Houthis took credit for it. I accept they're taking credit for it.
U.S. drones. Iran's hostility.
Shot down the drone because it was flying over their territory, or most likely flying over their territory. Again, the goal of Iran is not to provoke a war. So the drone, let me ask you this. What's more likely true? The U.S. was flying a drone just purely over international waters. It was a spy drone. Or the spy drone was doing what it was supposed to do and spy. They shot it out of the air. We don't know as a flat fact if that was in Iranian territory, but I put my money on that it was.
is substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013. And they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion.
The $100 billion was their money. It was their money. They weren't given anything. It was theirs. The notion that we should steal their money in this way, I'm astonished by this notion, this gangster politics. We can go into Syria and just steal their oil. And now his response is, well, we gave them $100 billion of their own money. We should have just kept their cash. This is an extraordinary speech. That's why I'm going through it. It's painful for me to hear twice. But this is absolutely unhinged and off the scale in regards to the propaganda that he's putting out here.
In cash. Instead of saying thank you to the United States, they chanted death to America. In fact, they chanted death to America the day the agreement was signed. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created...
Question first, who's they? Who's they? Are you talking about the entirety of the nation, what, 80 million people, that all 80 million people chant death to America? Or were there a few people within the country? Second question, do they have reason to make that case? Meaning, do they have just cause to say death to America? And third, do our politicians go about saying similar things to Iran? Lindsey Graham is outright unhinged. John Bolton is outright unhinged. You can make a case that says America is continuously saying death to Iran. I hope you get my point. This is obscene in regards to what he's saying here. I don't remember if he took questions after this, but I would have several, and they would be pointed.
Hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration.
This is ludicrous. This is ludicrous. Let's keep going. At this point, we're now in political season, and he's using this as a way of attacking Joe Biden of sorts. Meaning the Biden and Obama administration gave Iran $100 billion of their own money, mind you. And they used that money to buy missiles that essentially attacked and potentially killed U.S. personnel. So yeah, Joe Biden was part of that administration. Not so subtle.
The regime also greatly tightened the reins on their own country, even recently killing 1,500 people at the many protests that are taking place all throughout Iran. The very defective JCPOA expires shortly anyway and gives Iran a clear and quick path to nuclear breakout. Iran must abandon its nuclear ambitions and end its support for terrorism. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality.
It's time for those countries to recognize the reality, all right, that the U.S. has effectively become a rogue nation. Europe has to make a choice. Are you going to continuously be the U.S. essentially whipping boy and going along with whatever the United States comes up with the U.S. policy? And especially on this one, if you remember, we didn't entirely feel overtly the consequences of George Bush going into Iraq. Yes, we spent $7 trillion. Yes, we had 4,000 Americans that were killed. And yes, it's also true that for the most part, you had these people who were sent from home, and the war budget and our policies for the most part kind of organized around it. That's true. But we didn't entirely feel the effects in the way that Europe felt them, in the way that the Middle East felt them. 1 million people died in that war, not to mention the destruction of infrastructure, the creation of ISIS, the support of ISIS for the Syrian conflict, the migration of people trying to flee a war zone, the number of those people that ended up in Europe that destabilized the politics of Europe in combination with austerity. Europe felt the effects of the Iraq War far more than the United States did in regards to the disruption of their politics. The question becomes, is Europe okay with sleepwalking and stumbling into another larger conflict because of a president like Trump? Do you continuously back up U.S. foreign policy, even when that foreign policy is absolutely unhinged? All of the European leaders agreed with the JCPOA, and yet they didn't entirely bitch and make a big deal out of it when Trump pulled out. Yes, they ballyhooed a bit, but for the most part, when Iran even mentioned budging on some of the protocols, they flipped out. You're big and tough when you're going with Iran, but when the United States literally pulls out of it, you have nothing to say. Squat, bum. At some point, Europe needs to stiffen its back. And whether it wants some level of world stabilization or not, and some tally is going to depend on whether or not you ostracize the rogue nation of the bunch and stand with the countries that were actually standing with the agreement. I mean, why do you have an agreement if you're not necessarily going to back up the party who is staying with the agreement? I hope you understand what I mean. Yes, they've blown the agreement off at this point, but Europe wasn't backing them up in real legitimate terms. Yes, they were doing that system to try to get around some of it. But at this point, the agreement is off. We've just murdered one of their heads of state. The agreement is off. There's no point in sticking with the agreement. Europe doesn't seem to do anything to back them up. Russia and Iran and China, for the most part, have ended up with this kind of axis of sorts. Let's let him finish. I'm aggravated by the speech, and I'm aggravated by everything that's taking place here.
They must now break away from
the nuclear missiles that they were supposedly trying to do was only for defensive reasons. And the U.S. has effectively taken the policy that if you ever get to a point where you can defend yourself, we will preemptively destroy you. Think about what I'm saying for the moment. Ultimately, the only reason that the U.S. doesn't want Iran to get nuclear weapons is not for the terrorist aspect. It's that we can no longer just willy-nilly attack you in the way that we attacked you. Think of the North Korea problem. North Korea has a nuclear weapon. If you attack North Korea, that nuclear weapon may end up in Japan or South Korea. What happens if Iran is nuclear? Can Israel continuously do those strikes? Can the United States willy-nilly do those strikes? And even if the U.S. gets involved from the standpoint of a war, a nuke of Israel seems just off the table. My point is, a lot of this, if Iran was trying to get a weapon, it was only for defensive purposes, kind of like North Korea, because they didn't trust the U.S. as an honest actor in the Middle East. They could see what happened to Iraq. And again, if Saddam Hussein had a nuclear weapon, would the United States be able to do what the United States did without taking a second thought of where that nuclear weapon is going to go? The issue with Iran having a weapon is not this fear that they're going to use it. It's more so a fear that they can defend themselves. I hope you understand what I mean. I don't want you to be able to stand up. So if you try to, I'm going to punch you in the eye. That's effectively what this is. Just saying. Let him finish.
the remnants of the Iran deal, or JCPOA. And we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place.
Right here. And this is the point. That's the point. This entire speech really only boils down to two main things of value. One, de-escalation. We're going to apply sanctions. Two, Donald Trump, will not let Iran get a nuclear weapon, meaning he's speaking to the fact that Iran is essentially saying, all right, look, you are not staying with the deal, so we're not going to stay with the deal. And what you just heard right there, this notion that I want a deal. I got into this saying that I was going to get a new deal with Iran. Now, I've made the argument that there is no leeway for negotiation. Even back then, especially back now, Trump is saying, I want to get a good deal for the so-and-so, but the JCPOA was horrible. This is one of his campaign things. All of this is still the quote-unquote pressure strategy. But again, I made the point that the pressure strategy has no capacity to win. It's either the pressure strategy where Trump backs off or a war. You don't have these two things. There is no leeway for negotiation in Iran in regards to the JCPOA. None. So the only thing Trump is ever going to get is this pressure strategy or a war.
must also make a deal that allows Iran to thrive and prosper and take advantage of its enormous untapped potential. Iran can be a great country. Peace and stability cannot prevail in the Middle East as long as Iran continues to foment violence, unrest, hatred, and war.
I don't even need to respond to that one. I'm just going to let that one ride. I'm just going to let that one ride. I don't even need to respond to it. Let's keep going.
The civilized world must send a clear and unified message to the Iranian regime. Your campaign of terror, murder, mayhem will not be tolerated any longer. It will not be allowed to go forward. Today, I am going to ask NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East process. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before, and America's
National Alliance Treaty Organization. NATO supposedly was there in order to hold back the Red Menace, these Ruskies with boots on their shoulders, trying to take down Europe. That was supposedly the point of NATO. At least that was what it was a stated objective. NATO, at the point where the Soviet Union went belly up, was not supposed to expand. There were promises and assurances that were made by the United States to the Russians. We even made promises that we won't take advantage of you the moment that you go belly up. That didn't happen. That didn't happen at all. In fact, none of that happened. We continuously expanded NATO to the point where it's on the borders of Russia, even to the point of trying to get into Ukraine, which is literally on the border of Russia, going so far as to assist in fomenting a coup in that country. So what he's saying here is mind-blowing. I want to get an organization that was expressly built for the Soviet Union, something that no longer exists, to now work in the Middle East. NATO is effectively just a U.S. military arm, or arm of the U.S. military, or let's say U.S. will, let's say it that way, in European arena. And now he's talking about using that for the Middle East. That's extraordinary. Let's keep going.
Achieved energy independence. These historic accomplishments change our strategic priorities. These are accomplishments that nobody thought were possible. And options in the Middle East became available. We are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration at a cost of $2.5 trillion. U.S. armed forces are stronger than ever before. Our missiles are big, powerful, accurate, lethal, and fast. Under construction are many hypersonic missiles. The fact that we have this great military and equipment, however, does not mean we have to use it. We do not want to use it. American strength, both military and economic, is the best deterrent. 3 months ago, after destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate, we killed the savage leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, who was responsible for so much death, including the mass beheadings of Christians, Muslims, and all who stood in his way.
If we've taken down 100% of ISIS, why are we still in the Middle East? If the stated objective and reason that we were in the Middle East was in order to deal with ISIS, I mean, after all, that's supposedly why Iraq invited the U.S. to come back into Iraq. If that's true, then why on earth are we still in the Middle East?
He was a monster. Al-Baghdadi was trying again to rebuild the ISIS caliphate and failed. Tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed or captured during my administration. ISIS is a natural enemy of Iran. The destruction of ISIS is good for Iran, and we should work together on this and other shared priorities. Finally, to the people and leaders of Iran. We want
One quick note. General Qasem Soleimani was credited, not just, by me or random people, credited even by CNN for being the defeater of ISIS. Meaning, even CNN recognized him. Right here. Look at the Iranian general involved in the ISIS fight. Even CNN is giving him credit for this. And this is the guy that we killed. And Trump is saying defeating ISIS is good for the Iranians. Yes, it is, which is why they were instrumental in working to defeat ISIS. Like I said, the speech is extraordinary.
you to have a future, and a great future, one that you deserve. One of prosperity at home and harmony with the nations of the world. The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. I want to thank you, and God bless America. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is a ludicrous speech. But the key points. Trump is de-escalating. He's not essentially using military armaments in response to the 15 rockets that apparently landed in the 2 bases in Iraq. On the secondary point, he's using this as a campaign thing to attack Joe Biden. Essentially, all of this money was given, and now they were using this for missiles that are attacking our personnel. That's campaign rhetoric. The third is that he still wants a deal, meaning all of this is still working under the strategy of pressure. We want to use a pressure strategy. Would killing one of the members of their military part of that? Yes, it would be. Would destroying elements even under the Iraqi government, meaning the military, the Quds Force that was under the Popular Mobilization Unit? Yes, that would also account for under the pressure strategy. This is what he wants. He wants a deal. The problem here is there is no deal to be had. There wasn't a deal to be had when you first got in office. There's not a deal to be had, especially now. The only alternative to that is war. Or, for the most part, Trump backs down. It doesn't seem like he's backing down, and he seems to be continuously escalating this. The killing of a general is outright provocative. That is extraordinary. That's now okay, and that's now fair game. But ultimately, he's not going to get what he wants. And so it seems you have this kind of weird, stalemate of sorts. By the same token, a few things became clear, though. Iran did not want to provoke a war. Iran is trying to be a rational actor in this. They have to deal with a population that is angry and upset. By the same token, they can't deal with it in a way that outright provokes a U.S. response. They have to walk a line on this one. They alerted the bases that the shots were coming. They even alerted them to certain bases where the Iraqis need to stay away from. Supposedly, the Iraqis were the ones that tipped off the United States about the attack. I would make the case that the Iranians, I would imagine, in telling Iraq, knew that they were going to tip off the United States for that particular attack. The goal of this was not to kill U.S. personnel. The goal of this was to have a show of force. Again, weakness, masquerading as strength. Donald Trump is doing something similar. Powerful sanctions, powerful strangling their economy. The language, the tone that he's using is all to get across this big alpha male thing. But ultimately, this is a de-escalation. You went from murdering members of their government to, I'm going to put on more sanctions, and something where you've already strangled them with sanctions. Abu Kwara. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. All right, I'm going to end this because this has gone far, far too long. Look, there's something in the head of certain people. And it's not just certain people, it's people when they get into a position of authority, especially if they have power under them. Think for the most part of a cop, where it's like, you're disrespecting my authority. The catch here is the United States, particular presidents, take a similar tack with other countries around the world, countries that are sovereign nations. The notion that you can take this tact as if you are somehow over that country is extraordinary. I don't necessarily know what gave this country the neck or the spine to do such a thing. Just because you became a superpower after World War II The honest reality of it is it was the Soviets that pushed back the Nazis. The United States did help, especially with the tools and everything else. My only point is this policeman of the world stuff is a bit much. And it continuously positions you into a position of conflict, especially with other nations that are sovereign territories. All of those territories have the right to defend themselves. The notion that we're going to enter a negotiation and you're going to say, we need you to completely disarm and entirely capitulate before we talk to you, is nonsense. No country, no leader, no government would accept terms like that. But those are the terms that are being offered across the world to governments that Trump doesn't like, which is why Trump is entirely and continuously failing on the notion of foreign policy. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.